So Jeff Marks, I'm with you. I think it was a bad idea to show that video right before giving this talk. But Jeff, I'm really more than honored to be here today with this wonderful group of people whose lives have been impacted by you. And I just want to talk a little bit, as several of the other speakers have alluded to, about Jeff's generational impact on the training of all surgeons in the field that's so dear to his part, that of flexible endoscopy. I'd like to begin by just pausing for a second and asking us to think about what we mean when we talk about leadership. A number of us have alluded to it today, or will be alluding to it in the talks that follow. One way of thinking about it, I think, and Jeff to me is an epitome of this definition, is that leadership is influence in the lives of others. It's founded on credibility, and it's for the service of others. Those three things of influence, credibility, and service are things that Jeff exemplifies, perhaps as no other surgical mentor has in my own life. Jeff's credibility of excellence, you've heard the stories about how before he was done with his training, he was the endoscopist of choice at university hospitals, and that people who told him he couldn't didn't create barriers for him, and that he knew that becoming truly outstanding at what he did was the pathway for navigating those kinds of objections and obstacles. The way Jeff built, as several speakers again have alluded to, credibility on both sides of the aisle of the endoscope, if you will, and thereby became a diplomatic influence within the field that both sides could listen to and learn from, was, I think, in many ways unparalleled in his generation. He, as he said himself in the video clip earlier, the only person who's been president of both the ASGE and of SAGES. And then, as I think I'll develop a little bit in my subsequent comments, Jeff also, because of his position of influence, had a unique place in American surgery that allowed him to speak with authority on issues of educational importance, including about endoscopy. And that unique set of qualities that he embodied is really why many of us are here today and why surgical endoscopy training in the United States is where it is today. So if we think about Jeff's story, you've heard this, and some of you have alluded to this already, but his years of presidency roles with key societies. I would also highlight that Jeff's influence wasn't just in his areas of clinical interest, but his leadership skills, those qualities I was just alluding to, led to him being a chair for the American Board of Surgery in the mid-2000s. And remember some of these dates as I show some things that will follow. And also in senior leadership in our most prestigious academic organizations, such as the ASA. I can't think of anyone who has that constellation of influence in our discipline. And again, it's built on who he was and the excellence with which he pursued everything he did. That's the foundation of the things I'm going to talk about today. The other thing that I really want to set the stage with is that as we think about Jeff's influence, it's not just an influence that's in titles and in senior roles in organizational structures. It's written in the lives of people. Jeff trained 44, if I counted right, surgical endoscopy fellows from 1985 to 2020. As some of you may know, we have grandchildren here with us today, at least some of the time. It's tough. The attention span is tough. Sometimes it's tough for me, and I've had a lot more years to practice than they have. But Jeff has surgical endoscopy grandchildren, and Jeff, tell me, do you have great-grandchildren now? Yeah, so think about this. There are like 4 generations of surgeons trained in endoscopy because of what Jeff has done. I've listed there, I won't go through them all, some of the educational titles that he's had in his different institutions. I highlight there that a person who's of national influence needs to be locally credible. They need to be the person who walks the walk day in and day out in front of their colleagues at their elbow. And when you hear Jeff talk about AMI, Jeff's relationships with the people that knew him best were every bit as rich, if not richer, in terms of respect and shared models of what it meant to be excellent at what we did as those that he enjoyed with his national colleagues. And the lineage that's come from this, and we're hearing from many of these people today, and I'll comment again about a few of them in a moment, has really been the foundation of a generational seismic shift in how surgeons are trained in this whole field because of this man's influence. So some examples, and look at, you're hearing from most of these people today, but the fundamentals of endoscopic surgery, Brian briefly alluded to. The committee that put that together was chaired by Jeff Marks. Two subsequent committee chairs are Jose Martinez, who was trained by Brian Duncan, who was trained by Jeff, and Eric Pauli. The fundamentals of endoscopy curriculum, which is the longitudinal curriculum over the whole course of a resident's journey that forms the foundation so that they can take a high-stakes standardized exam, was really written by Brian Duncan. Again, one of Jeff's fellows. So what we see happening through Jeff and the people he trained, and if you will, infected with his passion for excellence in this area and his recognition that it was a foundational discipline for the excellent care of the gastrointestinal disease patient, has led to national level changes that have brought in the best of educational science and a competency-based orientation that was not present heretofore. Now, why was this competency thing such a big deal? Well, Jeff encountered early in his career opposition, and the opposition was turf-oriented, but it doesn't go away. And we as surgeons can be prone to this as well, by the way. I'm not trying to just put this on our GI colleagues, but you all know that back in 2011, there were 4 of our leading GI societies who looked at what the American Board of Surgery was doing around number requirements for surgery residents in training in the area of endoscopy, and because it overlapped with what they trained people for, they looked at it critically and said, this is inadequate, this isn't the kind of training that leads to competence, and they were critical that the board was even taking a stance on these things. And they had a reason to do that. If we're honest about it, there were data points in the literature that suggested that the outcomes were different for patients when they were cared for endoscopically by surgeons versus gastroenterologists. These are just a few that came up in the area of colonoscopy and lesion detection and colon cancer prevention. Now, to be sure, there were other articles we like to cite as surgeons, like Steve Wexner's study on colonoscopy that showed surgeons could do it well. But we needed to have a substantive answer to these things. And as we, that is, some of the people Jeff trained, leaned into some of these questions, we found ourselves, and I again would highlight the work of Jeff and Brian as leaders in this, saying what would it look like to really make competence the goal and not just numbers as a surrogate for competence. And when I think about the current debates going on in medical education in general, we were a forerunner of some of the things that we're working on to this day across the medical disciplines. So the ASGE at the time had a numbers-oriented solution, and they said you needed to do 275 colonoscopies to be competent. It's really interesting to look at this now vis-a-vis some of the other procedures on here. That was more than you needed to do EUS or pretty much anything else on the menu here. 200 ERCPs. I mean, I saw a number of us in the room have done these procedures. I'm not sure why colonoscopy required so many, but it was a numbers solution. And actually, as Jeff alluded to in some of his video comments earlier, we knew that numbers weren't a good surrogate. These were a couple publications from the literature coming from gastroenterology colleagues. One of the top one looked at advanced endoscopy training in 5 of the leading so-called third-tier fellowships around the country where people acquired advanced skills like ERCP and EUS, and found that the variability in terms of reaching competence was from as few as 26 procedures to over 200, to the point Jeff made earlier in his video. We knew that numbers didn't tell us whether a trainee was getting to the point where we could really entrust them with patient care, and that many of the numbers that were being talked about at the time were not being met in the training programs, as that second study, which was from Chris Thompson's group, referenced. And furthermore, while we were saying numbers were the metric, we weren't actually collecting numbers, and there was no case log system for gastroenterology fellowships. So what were surgeons going to say in response to this? Well, we knew from our own literature that a proficiency or competency-oriented training paradigm made a difference, that was a better metric to chase, and that we could establish what that looked like by looking at expert performance and then train people in that direction oriented towards the tasks that led to excellence and competence, as opposed to simply asking for numbers as a surrogate thereof. And what this ultimately led to was the development of a mandate for standardized curricula. And you've heard from Nat Soper already, you've heard from Jeff in the video clips about the beginnings of laparoscopic training and how SAGES as an organization, through leaders such as they, came up with a standardized curriculum to teach basic laparoscopy skills that they and others in the room, Jerry Fried's here, contributed greatly to the science that led us to the place where we could have competency-oriented training programs and fundamentals programs that could be mandated by boards to help produce a good product in honor of the public trust. Instead of talking about numbers, we began to do studies, and Brian showed the gauges form, began to use standardized scoring rubrics to look at what level a person's performance started to plateau. And you can see that the numbers from these early gauges studies, both with upper endoscopy and with colonoscopy, were not in the range of those being touted. And this doesn't mean that all competence is now determined by a number and now we've got a new number. It meant that we were comparing people's performance to a competency-oriented framework and a validated scoring system. We also knew that this was important because of demographic need. And one of the things I've admired in the latter years of Jeff's career and through Lee's work as well is MedWorks and other efforts to really reach out to the needs of those who are disparately cared for in our system and provide them health care. Well, we knew as surgeons that in rural settings, endoscopy was actually the predominant procedural component of a surgical practice. And this meant that surgeons needed to be trained if we were going to serve those populations well. And in fact, if you looked specifically at critical access hospitals, the amount of endoscopy being done, there was a huge gap between what we were training people to do in terms of the volume of experience and what was needed for that kind of care. We also knew from our own recertification data at the board, and again, I want to highlight here that Jeff was one of those unique individuals who had worked at a high level for the board, had worked at a leadership level in surgical societies, including SAGES and endoscopically oriented ones, and had the credibility of having worked in the GI world as well and led there. We knew that the numbers were going up actually, and that endoscopy as an area was perhaps the most predominant procedural domain for surgeons, again, especially those in rural practice, but really across the board. So again, this led to innovations such as the FEC that I've already talked about and that Brian did the work on to make possible for us to have such a curriculum that could be implemented on a nationwide basis and that was oriented to equipping a whole generation of trainees to do endoscopy with a solid cognitive foundation. And FES, and I won't belabor all the points here, but I want to highlight that the person that wrote this key article on why we did it in the first place is another Jeff Ponsky fellow, Jeff Hazy, who that many of you in the audience know. And I won't enumerate all these things because I think we've all been saying in our talks, but we knew that this was a requirement to have a high standard of training for people to render the care that the future of the discipline would require, that the public trust required, and that the field of surgery, GI surgery, required. And that we wanted to ensure competency as the bottom line, not just experience. So this ultimately led to the creation of a curriculum, as I've said, and then ultimately a mandate for FES after a lot of work by Jeff Marks, Jerry Fried, and others in the room to put together a high-stakes exam and testing platform for the skills, the technical skills, to build on the cognitive foundation that Brian's work in FEC had led to. And I would highlight, Jeff, that in our most contemporary discussions about the future of general surgery as a field, And I would highlight here the EPA project that some of you are familiar with and that is now my full-time job. One of the EPAs for general surgery is flexible endoscopy. And I have little doubt that had it not been for you and those you've trained, I'm not so sure that would have been on the menu, as it will be for all surgeons going forward. I want to conclude by just saying a couple things, and I loved what Jeff said, Jeff Marks, near the end of his talk, and others have alluded to too. Jeff, I love the way you and Jackie have modeled an integrated life for all of us. And David Leach said this when he left the ACGME, we teach who we are. Perhaps the greatest treasure I think you've left in all the lives represented in the room today is you didn't just teach us ERCP. You didn't just teach us how to be good teachers. You didn't just teach us work-life integration. You taught us who you were, and that became a treasure to each of us, and it made us become different people. And the hidden curriculum that you gave us in that was maybe the richest thing that we took from you. As I think about, and you've seen some of these pictures already, I think we all had the same internet sites we were surfing on. But Jeff, as I think about you and that integration feature, I think about the way you've integrated yourself into our surgical organizations, into relationships with colleagues, but also the way the same things have been reflected in your family. And I learned a new word from Lee Cohen a couple years ago, the word mensch. I've already heard it used once this morning. I've come to see you that way, Jeff, and to see what a precious thing that is. And as I think about integration, I wanted to close with this, and I loved in your own comments just a few moments ago, you talked about how part of your Jewish heritage was the commitment to pass it on to the next generation. And those of you who are Jewish in the audience will recognize this from the Shema, but basically, Jeff, I see what you've done as a person with your family and at what you've done with us as your professional colleagues and your trainees is you've done this. You've lived this day in, day out. When you get up, when you sit down, you've been consistent, and that has made a lasting difference in our field. So thank you.